Well, good morning. You guys typically don't see the haze in the 9 o'clock service, so just picture that as dragon breath this morning. We are finishing up our series today called Slaying the Debt Dragon, based off of this book by Sherry Lowe. I've got one of these books to give away in this service this morning. Anybody want this book? It's yours if you want it. All right, Linda, you want to come up and get it? It's yours. We're going to finish up this morning, and as we do that, I'm going to ask you to take out your Bibles and open them up to Exodus chapter 16. Or take a phone if you'd rather pull out your phone. Or if you don't have a Bible or a phone with you, you'll find a Bible there in the seats in front of you. Just reach down there and get that Bible. By the way, if you don't have one at home that you can read or that's easy to understand, that's a New Living Translation. Take it with you. It's easier to read and understand. We're going to get to Exodus chapter 16 here in just a minute. But as we do that, I'm going to put some names, I guess, if you will, up on the screen here this morning. And here's what I want you to do. Where you're sitting, I want you to take these names or these people, and I want you to rank them in order of how you trust them. So from the least amount of trust to the greatest amount of trust, all right? I'll give you a few minutes to do that while you're looking for Exodus 16 as well. But in your mind, you may have to write it down if you don't think that you can keep it together in your mind. But just think about these people and how you would trust them from the least amount of trust to the greatest amount of trust, all right? If you get that in your mind, you might want to turn to somebody sitting next to you and just say, I don't trust this one at all, and I trust this one the most, all right? All right. Now, I had to think about how to do this because this is extremely dangerous. But because we're in church on Sunday morning, I'm just going to ask this. Who do you have at the top of your list in terms of who you trust the greatest? You're all such good church people. Now, here's my question for us this morning. When it comes to money, do we really trust God? If you got change in your pocket or a bill in your wallet or your purse, maybe you want to just take and look at it right now. This is a quarter that I've got in my pocket. And on the quarter, of course, it's got Washington's picture. It's got United States of America. It's got quarter dollar. But in little print on the front of the quarter, it says, in who? God we trust. If I pull out from my wallet, which I never carry cash, but because we're talking about this morning, I actually have a Benjamin Franklin in my wallet. And so if security up front, please. And so when I pull out the Franklin and I look on the back, guess what it says? In God we trust. Well, we've had all this money up at the front of the platform for this entire sermon series. None of you knew it was real or it would be gone already. No, it's really not. When I look at this money, it does not say in God we trust. Here's what it says: for motion picture use only. But I want us to think this morning about the question, when it comes to money, do we really trust God? Because I think we have to take a really hard, close look at that question. And we may come up with an answer that we're really not comfortable with. Because if we really trusted God, when we really trust God with our money, it means that perhaps we live at the standard at which He blesses us. If we really trust God with our money, then perhaps we don't need MasterCard or Visa or American Express. If we really, really trust God with our money, perhaps we would be a people who beat the national statistic of giving away 3% of everything that God blesses us with every year. I know this is really hard for us, but we really have to ask ourselves this morning, do we trust God with money? Really, do we trust God? As we wrap up this debt series today, this Slaying the Debt Dragon, this money series, we have to tackle the question, do I trust God? So to do that, we're going to look in Exodus chapter 16. So if you're there, I want you to open, keep your phone there. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 16, 17, all morning long. Now let me tell you where we're at in Exodus chapter 16. God has rescued his people from slavery in Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt, had been for quite some time, very harsh living and working conditions. And God raised up a man called Moses to go in and lead the people out of slavery, out of Egypt. And Moses did just that. They crossed the Red Sea. They are now into the wilderness. And they've only been in the wilderness for a few days. And guess what they begin to do? They begin to whine and complain. Now, this scripture is not up on the screen, but in Exodus chapter 16, verse 3, it says, "And the people of Israel said to them," to Moses and to Aaron, "Would that we have died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." They had walked away from slavery into what would become eventually their destination of the promised land. And just days into that journey, they already want to go back to where they came from. Oh, at least where we were in Egypt, at least when we were slaves, we had meat to eat. We had all the meat we could ever want to eat. At least when we were there in slavery, we didn't go hungry. And now here we are out in the wilderness and we're hungry. Can't we just go back to Egypt? Now, I'm going to take the liberty to take a little detour here this morning, and then I'll bring us back. Are you okay with that? The last year at Aldersgate has been a year of great change. Staff positions, Impact Campus changes, remodeling, 3 services, changes with kids programming, changes with student programming, changes with adult programming, and there's more change to come. And what I see in Exodus chapter 16 is that anytime God begins to lead us through change, we often begin to cry, can't we just go back to where we came from? It was so comfortable there. It was so routine there. It was so normal there. Can't we just go back? Because you see, the Israelites in just days into their journey hadn't settled into the new normal. And in this change of going from normal to trying to find new normal, oftentimes we just begin to cry, I liked it better that way. I want to go back. And Moses has to remind them, you were slaves. You see, here's what I believe. Anytime God calls us into the new, it's going to require a lot of change. And in order to experience the new, we have to be okay with the change, if that's where God's leading. Now listen, when it comes to finances, here's what I would share with us this morning. If you're serious about slaying the debt dragon, if you're serious about changing your financial habits, if you're serious about doing things differently with money, when I began this series, we asked you, how many of you believe the Bible and the principles it teaches are truth? And 99% of you said, yes, we believe that the Bible is true and the principles it teaches are true. But when it comes to the way we live with money, we don't live the way the Bible asks us or teaches us to live. If we want to make that change, if we want to grow in this area of our lives, if we really want to trust God with our finances, we're going to walk through a wilderness of change. And we're going to begin to cry, let me just go back to spending money the way I was. Let me just go back to using the credit card the way I was. Let us just go back to when we didn't give away all this money we're giving away. Because it's uncomfortable. And Moses says, need I remind you, you were slaves. And God would say to us, need I remind you, you were slaves? Proverbs chapter 22, verse 7. The borrower is what? Slave to the lender. Anytime God begins to call us to something new, we're going to walk through a season of change, and we're always going to wish we could go back to the way it was. But to hold on to the promise that God has for us, we have to march through the change. to get to where it is that God wants us to be. If you're serious about slaying the debt dragon, you're going to have to walk through a season of change. And to get through that season of change, we have to know at the end of the day that we can trust God with our finances, with everything. And that's exactly what happens in Exodus chapter 16. Look at this, Exodus 16:4. Exodus 16:4. Then the Lord said to Moses, because that's what he did. He talked to Moses, and then Moses talked to the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, watch, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. Here's what he's saying, that I will ask them if they trust me, so they will see the promises that I have for them, that they are good and they are solid and they are hopeful, and that's exactly where I want them to be. Will they walk through the change, and will they trust me? And to help them with that trust, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to rain down bread from heaven. And guess what? If you read through Exodus 16, God did exactly that. The next morning they got up, and outside on the ground, out of their tents, they found this bread-like substance. They had never seen it before. It was a white, flaky, almost seed-like substance. And later we're told in Exodus chapter 16 that it tasted like honey crackers. And God instructed the people to go out and gather the manna. That's what they called it, because it came, when they looked at it, they said, what is it? That was literally translated into manna. That God rained down this manna from heaven, and he did it every single day except for the Sabbath. And he told them, listen, when you go out and you gather the manna every single day, you only gather what you need for that day, except on the day before the Sabbath, and then you gather what you need for 2 days. And guess what they did? Yep, they went out and gathered as much as they could, because they thought they would never see it again, because they didn't trust God. I don't even have to preach about that with our finances, do I? They went out and they gathered as much as they could, and guess what happened to it? The part they didn't use turned into worms. It got wormy. God said, trust me in this. I will give it to you every single day. Just go gather what you need for that day. And then the day before the Sabbath, gather what you need for 2 days, and you will have it for 2 days. And it won't turn wormy. And guess what? It didn't. God was saying to them, will you trust me? Will you trust me to meet what you need every single day? And God says the same thing to you and to me. Will you trust me to meet your daily needs? Needs, not wants. Will you trust me to meet your daily needs? Jesus taught us this in the New Testament. When you pray, pray like this. God, give us today our daily bread. Will you meet my needs for this day? Listen, when we trust God in our finances, the first area we trust him with is that every single day he will meet our needs. Now listen, I'm going to be very honest with you, and I'm going to confess that I struggle with this. And here's the reason I struggle. Because I've seen with my own eyes people around the world who struggle every single day to get enough food to eat. Okay, let me rewind a little bit. If we truly trusted God with our finances, to the point where if we believe the principles the Bible teaches are true, and one of those principles that it preaches is for us to give, that if we would give, people around the world wouldn't be hungry. We were here last week, 1 Timothy chapter 6. In verse 17, it says this, as for the rich in this present age, that's all of us, charge them not to be haughty nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God. Who are we supposed to trust in? God. By the way, remember in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus said, listen, you can't have it both ways. You can't have money and me. You can have one or the other. You can't love money and me. Here's what he's saying. You can't trust money and me. You will either trust money or me. And here Timothy is hearing from Paul. We should put our trust in God, not our resources, not our stuff, not our money. God is the one who richly provides us with everything we have to enjoy. And then for those of us who have, here's what it says. We are to do good, to be rich in good works, and to be generous and ready to share. That's why here at Aldersgate we are committed to giving away $2 for every $3 God blesses us with. And we work with organizations around the world. Aim for India. Today there are students there in an orphanage that get fed every single day because we give. In just a couple of weeks my family will be in Guatemala. There are kids there in an orphanage who get food every single day because you give. And when you give, part of what you give goes to feed those kids in Guatemala. And guess what? It happens right here in Lubbock. We partner with organizations such as Hope Community of Shalom, the Bridge of Lubbock, Paul's Project. We partner with all of these things to make sure that those who live right here in Lubbock who go without food will have food, because those who are rich in this present age are commanded to give. Do we trust God enough to do that? Do we trust God enough that He will even meet our own daily needs? Do we trust Him? Do we trust Him? He was building trust in His people when every morning they would go out and find bread, manna on the ground for them to pick up and eat. They did that for 40 years. Just think about how they complained about it on year 20, year 30, and year 40. But that's not all God did. In Exodus chapter 16, verse 13, we read this. In the evening, quail came up and covered the camp. Not just did He bring a manna or bread every single morning, but this one evening, and He does this on a couple of occasions in their time in the wilderness. You can also read about it in Numbers chapter 11. Those are two separate occasions. And on this occasion, in the evening, He brings quail into the camp. Now listen to me. When He brought quail into the camp, it wasn't like the manna. He was still saying, will you trust me? But here's what He was saying. Will you partner with me? You see, He brought the quail into the camp, but it wasn't something that they could just go out and gather and bring in. They still had to go out and hunt the quail. It was like deer hunters who sit in the blind. The deer come to you, right? I'm just preaching to the wrong crowd, aren't I? This is what the quail were like. They just came to them, but they still had to hunt them. They still had to go out. They still had to get them. They still had to kill them. They had to prepare them. They had to partner with God in order to participate in what God was giving to them. God asked you and I to do that. That's why we work. That's why we try to further ourselves with education, and why we try to get promotions so that we can increase the amount of resources that God can bless us with. Listen, in particular to debt. When God says He's going to help us get out of debt, here's what He says. You got to work with me. Maybe you need to earn some extra income. Pick up a part-time job. Do some odd jobs to earn some extra income. Maybe you need to cut your expenses. Work with me here. Trust me. Live on what I'm giving you to live. I will meet your daily needs. Now you live with where I meet you. Sell stuff. You don't need it. Get rid of it. You don't need that car. You don't need that house. Will you work with me? Will you cooperate with me? Listen, God will provide, but oftentimes He asks us to partner with Him in that provision, to help Him in that provision. He says, will you trust me? Yes, we'll trust you, God. We will do whatever it is that you are asking us to do, and that requires work. It requires a sacrifice on our part. And there's another way that God provides. If you look at Exodus chapter 17 in this story. In Exodus chapter 17, after they had bread every morning and quail on this one occasion, guess what? They got thirsty. And there's no water for them to drink. And so in Exodus chapter 17, God continues to provide for them. If you look at verse 6, He says, behold, I will stand before you there. He's talking to Moses. I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink. Listen to me. When we trust God and God provides, sometimes He does that by just doing a miracle. You live in West Texas. You tell me, have you ever seen water come from a rock? Oftentimes, God chooses to provide through miraculous wonders. In your financial journey, in your journey to get rid of debt, God will probably do some miracles along the way. Amy and I can tell you several stories on our journey to slay debt when money would just show up in our mailbox out of nowhere, when God would bless us with gifts from people that had no idea what we were going through or what was happening. Occasionally, God just does miracles. The writer of Psalm 140 talks about this. Psalm 105, verses 40 through 41. 105, 40 through 41, the psalmist says this: they asked, don't forget that part. They asked God to provide. And he brought quail, and he gave the bread from heaven in abundance. He opened the rock, and water gushed out, and it flowed through the desert like a river. Listen, every single day when you look at a quarter, when you look at a dollar bill, a $10 bill, a $20 bill, a $100 bill, and you see the words, "In God we trust," you remember that God will provide what you need from day to day. Just ask for it. That oftentimes God will provide above and beyond that, but he asks you to partner with him in that provision. And that sometimes God will just flat out give you a miracle. And you can take this and translate it across any situation in your life, not just a financial situation, because that's who God is. I've got to confess to you this morning that this message was birthed out of a personal struggle with God. So I'm studying through the Old Testament. I used to say I'm reading through the Old Testament, but it's taking me so long now I'm saying I'm studying through the Old Testament. I'm studying through the Old Testament, and last year I was in Exodus in the summer and fall. I was studying through Exodus. And Exodus chapter 16 and 17, I got stuck on for several weeks because God and I were just wrestling over something and we were struggling. And so every morning I would meet him on my back porch with a cup of coffee and the Bible, and I would read the same text again, and we would have the same conversation again, and he would begin to show me things again, and we would struggle and we would wrestle with this, and this went on for weeks. And one morning, same routine, I was sitting on the back porch at the patio table with a cup of coffee, wrestling the same thing in Exodus chapter 16 and 17. And he had already shown me, listen, this is how I provide. Sometimes I just do miracles. Sometimes I'm going to provide, but I'm going to ask you to partner with me. And sometimes, all the time, I just meet what you need from day to day. Will you trust me? I was like, God, I really want to trust you, but I'm struggling here. And this has only happened to me a handful of times. But let me tell you what happened. I'm sitting here having this conversation with him. And out of nowhere, 5 quail fly into my backyard and land on our grass. And I kid you not, stare at me. It's like they were asking, will you trust me? Will you trust me? Will you trust me? It got my attention. I don't know what God has to do to get your attention this morning, but the question is the same. Will you trust him? Will you trust him? Will you trust him? God, we pray this morning that as you speak to us and work in our hearts and our minds, you would give us a willingness to trust you. God, in the area of our finances, if it has to do with living on what it is you're blessing us with, instead of trying to keep up with other people in our lives, that we would trust that you would meet every single need we have. That God, sometimes you would just send quail into our camp and you would show us where it is you want us to partner with you in the area of finances. If we're trying to slay the debt dragon, that you would show us where it is you want us to bring in extra income or cut expenses or sell things or whatever it is you're asking us to do. And God, of course, none of us in this room have a hard time praying that you would just do a miracle in an area we're having a hard time trusting you right now. God, would you help us trust you and know that you will provide in any situation. You will meet everything we need and even go so far and beyond. God, I pray for every single one of us in this room this morning, where regardless of where it is, we're having a hard time trusting you. Because we're in this series on money, God, I know that that's a struggle for most of us. But if it's an area of health, an area of relationship, an area of career, whatever it is, God, would you speak to us? Would you just send those quail into our presence right now? Grab our attention. Ask us the hard question. Will you trust me? Will you trust me?